In the quiet mountains where cell towers can't reach and the nearest neighbor is miles away, Sarah Martinez stood before a cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The roof sagged under years of neglect. Windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, and weeds had claimed the front porch, where her grandmother once sat with her morning coffee. 3 months after her divorce papers were signed and her savings account emptied by legal fees, this crumbling inheritance was all she had left. But sometimes the most broken things hold the greatest potential for transformation. As Sarah pulled the first board from a window and sunlight streamed into the dusty interior, she had no idea that rebuilding this cabin would mean rebuilding herself. What she discovered in those mountains would change everything she thought she knew about starting over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The musty air that greeted Sarah as she stepped inside carried decades of memories she couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light, illuminating water stains on the pine walls and a floor that creaked ominously under her hiking boots. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life at 42. 6 months ago, she'd been Sarah Martinez Hoffman, senior marketing director at a prestigious Denver firm, living in a suburban house with granite countertops and a husband who worked 80-hour weeks. Now, she was just Sarah Martinez again, standing in a one-room cabin with exactly $3,000 to her name and a Toyota Prius packed with everything she owned. The wedding ring that had once symbolized forever now sat at the bottom of a mason jar in her backpack, along with the ashes of a marriage that had burned down faster than a Colorado wildfire. Marcus had blindsided her with the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in March, citing irreconcilable differences. What he meant was that he'd found someone younger, someone who didn't question his late nights or the lipstick stains on his collar that weren't her shade. The legal battle that followed had drained their joint accounts and left Sarah with nothing but her grandmother's cabin deed and a heart full of bitter lessons about trust. She'd loved Marcus once, or thought she had. They'd met at a corporate retreat in Aspen, both climbing the ladder in their respective careers, both convinced they were building something lasting. But somewhere between the mortgage payments and the endless dinner parties with his colleagues, Sarah had lost herself. She'd become an accessory to his ambition, a polished wife who smiled at the right moments and never complained about the loneliness. Her grandmother, Elena, would have seen through Marcus from the beginning. Elena Martinez had been a force of nature, a woman who'd raised 5 children alone after her husband died in Vietnam, who'd built this cabin with her own hands in 1973. Sarah had spent every summer here until she was 16, learning to fish in the mountain streams, hiking trails that Elena had mapped herself. Sitting on this very porch, while her grandmother told stories about resilience and the healing power of solitude. Elena had passed away 2 years ago, leaving the cabin to Sarah with a handwritten note that simply said, "For when you need to remember who you are." At the time, Sarah had thought it was a sweet gesture but unnecessary. She'd been so confident in her marriage, her career, her carefully constructed life. The irony wasn't lost on her now. Sarah set her backpack down on the rough wooden table that Eleanor had built from a single pine log. The mason jar clinked against her water bottle, a sound that made her stomach clench with familiar grief. She'd put the ring in there after the divorce was finalized, unable to throw it away but unwilling to wear it. It felt appropriate somehow, preserving something that was already dead. The cabin's interior was simpler than her childhood memories had painted it. One main room with a stone fireplace, a loft accessed by a wooden ladder, and a small kitchen area with a hand pump for water. The bathroom was an outhouse 20 yards away, and electricity came from a generator that hadn't run in years. Elena had lived here every summer until she was 85, proving that happiness didn't require modern conveniences. Sarah pulled out her phone to take inventory photos, then remembered there was no signal. The silence was complete, except for the wind through the pine trees and the distant sound of running water from the creek Elena had always called the mountain's heartbeat. In Denver, there had always been noise, traffic, the constant hum of a city that never rested. Here the quiet felt almost sacred. She told her sister Carmen that this was temporary, just a place to regroup and figure out her next move. Carmen had been horrified, offering her guest room in Phoenix and lectures about throwing away her career. But Sarah knew she couldn't go back to that world yet. She needed time to heal, to remember who she'd been before she'd become half of a broken whole. As evening approached, Sarah unrolled her sleeping bag on the bare mattress in the loft. She'd brought camping gear, knowing the cabin would need work before it was truly livable. Through the small window above the bed, she could see stars appearing in a sky darker than any she'd seen in years. In the city, light pollution had stolen the stars. Here, they blazed with an intensity that made her remember Elena's stories about navigation and finding your way home. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of assessment and repair. Tonight, she would simply exist in this space her grandmother had loved, listening to the mountain's heartbeat and trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the loft window and the sound of something scratching at the cabin's exterior walls. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar sounds and the complete absence of traffic noise. When she finally climbed down the ladder, she discovered a family of raccoons had investigated her trash bag overnight, leaving a trail of scattered granola bar wrappers across the front porch. The morning light revealed the cabin's condition in unforgiving detail. What had seemed charmingly rustic in yesterday's golden hour now looked genuinely concerning. The roof showed obvious signs of water damage, with several missing shingles and a section near the chimney that sagged ominously. The windows she hadn't yet unboarded were cracked, and the front door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. Sarah started her assessment methodically, the way she'd once approached marketing campaigns. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making lists: immediate safety concerns, structural issues, cosmetic repairs. The water pump in the kitchen produced only a rusty trickle when she worked the handle, and the stone fireplace was filled with debris from what looked like a partially collapsed chimney liner. In the corner of the main room, she discovered a cedar chest she'd somehow missed in yesterday's emotional fog. The wood was solid despite its age, and the brass hinges still moved smoothly when she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, were pieces of her grandmother's life that Sarah had never seen. Elena's hiking journal lay on top, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Sarah opened it carefully, finding page after page of her grandmother's precise handwriting, documenting weather patterns, wildlife sightings, and trail conditions. But scattered between the practical observations were philosophical reflections that revealed a depth Sarah had only glimpsed as a child. "The mountain teaches patience," read one entry from 1987. "You cannot rush a sunrise or hurry the snow's melting. Everything happens in its proper season, including healing." Beneath the journal, Sarah found hand-drawn maps of hiking trails, some marked with Elena's personal notations: "Best view of the valley, hidden waterfall after spring thaw, where I scattered your grandfather's ashes." The maps were works of art, drawn with careful attention to landmarks and elevation changes, annotated with notes about seasonal variations and difficulty levels. Sarah had forgotten how extensively Eleanor had explored these mountains. As a child, she'd simply followed her grandmother's lead, never questioning how Elena knew exactly where to find the best berry patches or the clearest swimming holes. Now she realized Elena had spent decades methodically mapping every trail, creating a comprehensive guide to the wilderness around them. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, and Sarah looked up to see a large black bear ambling past the kitchen window. Her heart hammered as she pressed herself against the far wall, remembering Elena's lessons about mountain wildlife. The bear showed no interest in the cabin, simply continuing on its path toward the creek. But the encounter reminded Sarah how truly isolated she was here. Her phone remained stubbornly without signal, even when she held it up near the windows. Elena had lived here for decades, without constant connectivity, but Sarah felt the absence keenly. In Denver, she'd been perpetually available to clients, colleagues, even Marcus's endless demands for attention. The silence felt both liberating and terrifying. She attempted to fix the broken window in the kitchen, prying off the plywood backing and assessing the cracked glass. Her experience with home repairs was limited to changing light bulbs and unclogging drains, but YouTube tutorials had given her confidence that anyone could learn basic maintenance. Without internet access, however, she was relying on instinct and half-remembered observations of contractors at her old house. The window frame was more damaged than she'd initially thought. Wood rot had compromised the sill, and the glass would need complete replacement rather than simple repair. Sarah added window replacement to her growing list, along with estimates of costs that made her remaining savings seem increasingly inadequate. By mid-afternoon, her sister Carmen called from the landline at the general store 5 miles down the mountain. Sarah had given the number to family members for emergencies, though the walk to check messages felt like a journey in itself. "Sarah, please tell me you're coming to your senses." Carmen's voice crackled through the old phone. "Mum is worried sick, and honestly, I don't understand what you're trying to prove up there." Sarah found herself defending a decision she wasn't entirely sure she understood herself. "I need this time, Carmen. I need to figure out who I am without Marcus, without the job, without all the noise." "But you could figure that out in civilization," Carmen argued. "You could stay with me, get therapy, find a new job. This hermit thing isn't healthy." After hanging up, Sarah walked back to the cabin, feeling the weight of her family's concern. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was an elaborate form of self-punishment, a way to make her suffering visible and dramatic. But as she approached the cabin in the afternoon light, seeing it nestled among the towering pines with the mountains rising behind it, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of belonging. That evening, she cooked a simple meal on Elena's old camp stove and ate on the front porch, watching the light fade behind the peaks. The silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt full of possibility. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She dressed in her hiking boots and the practical clothes that had replaced her corporate wardrobe, then spread Eleanor's hand-drawn trail map across the kitchen table. The detailed sketches showed a network of paths radiating out from the cabin like arteries from a heart, each one labeled with Elena's careful notations. She chose the trail marked Morning Glory Creek for her first solo hike, a moderate path that Elena had rated as good for contemplation. The map showed the trail following the creek for about 2 miles before reaching a meadow that Elena had simply marked with a star and the words, "Sit here." The morning air was crisp and thin at 8,000 feet, carrying the scent of pine sap and wildflowers. Sarah had forgotten how hiking engaged every sense, how the mountain demanded presence in a way that her old life never had. In Denver, she'd moved through her days on autopilot, checking emails while walking, planning meetings during her commute. Here, a moment's inattention could mean a twisted ankle or a wrong turn. The trail Elena had mapped proved accurate down to the smallest detail. Sarah found the fallen log that served as a bridge over the creek, exactly where the map indicated, discovered the hidden spring that bubbled up from a cluster of moss-covered rocks, and reached the meadow after precisely the time Elena had estimated. The star on the map had marked a natural stone seat that offered a perfect view of the valley below. Sarah sat where her grandmother had sat decades before, feeling the sun warm her face while she listened to the creek's constant murmur. This was where Elena had come to think, to process whatever challenges life had thrown at her. Sarah could almost sense her grandmother's presence in this place. Could imagine Elena sitting here after her husband's death, after each of her children left home, after all the small and large griefs that shape a life. A sound behind her made Sarah turn to see an elderly woman approaching on the trail, moving with the careful but confident steps of someone who'd been hiking these mountains for years. The woman looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes the color of mountain lakes. "You must be Elena's granddaughter," the woman said without preamble. "I'm Dorothy Patterson. I live about a mile down the mountain from your cabin." Sarah stood and extended her hand. "Sarah Martinez. I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone else lived up here." Dorothy's handshake was firm and warm. "Elena mentioned you many times over the years. She always hoped you'd come back to the mountains." Dorothy's eyes were kind, but assessing. "How are you finding the cabin?" "It needs more work than I expected," Sarah admitted. "Everything needs repair or replacement." Elena knew that, Dorothy said. "She and I talked about it the last time I saw her. She said the cabin would give you something to do with your hands while your heart healed." The directness of the statement caught Sarah off guard. She'd told no one about the divorce except her immediate family. But somehow, this stranger seemed to understand her situation completely. Dorothy settled onto the stone seat beside Sarah. "Elena was my closest friend for 35 years. We hiked these trails together every week until her arthritis got too bad. She used to say that mountains don't judge, they just witness. That's what you need right now, isn't it? Witness without judgment." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a hawk circle high above the valley. Finally, Dorothy spoke again. "There's a man in town who knew Elena well. Jake Thorne runs a small construction business. Elena always said if anything happened to the cabin, Jake would know how to fix it right." "I don't have much money for contractors," Sarah said. Dorothy smiled. "Jake's not like most contractors. He cares more about preserving Elena's legacy than making a profit. She helped his family through some hard times years ago, and mountain people don't forget kindness." As they walked back down the trail together, Dorothy shared stories about Elena that Sarah had never heard. How Elena had helped deliver babies when the roads were snowed in. How she'd organized the community to fight a proposed logging operation. How she'd quietly supported families going through difficult times. "Your grandmother was the heart of this community," Dorothy explained. "She believed that healing happened in connection with others and with the land. That's why she left you the cabin. She knew you'd need both." Back at the cabin, Dorothy accepted Sarah's invitation for coffee, which they made on the camp stove and drank from Elena's mismatched ceramic mugs. The older woman examined the cabin's condition with an expert eye, pointing out which repairs were urgent and which could wait. "The roof is your first priority," Dorothy said. "Everything else can be fixed gradually, but water damage will destroy the whole structure if you don't address it soon." As Dorothy prepared to leave, she pressed a folded piece of paper into Sarah's hand. "Jake's phone number. The general store has a phone you can use. Tell him Dorothy sent you, and mention that it's about Elena's cabin. He'll come." That evening, Sarah cooked another simple meal and ate on the porch, but this time she wasn't alone with her thoughts. She felt connected to something larger than herself, part of a community she was just beginning to understand. Elena's maps had shown her the physical trails that crisscrossed these mountains, but Dorothy had revealed the human connections that made this place truly home. As darkness fell and the stars emerged with startling clarity, Sarah realized she was no longer running away from her old life. She was walking toward something new, something she couldn't yet define, but could feel taking shape with each step on Elena's carefully mapped trails. The next morning brought crystalline air and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Sarah woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee brewed on the camp stove, she pulled out Elena's hand-drawn trail map and traced the route marked Morning Glory Trail. Moderate difficulty, spectacular views. The trail began just behind the cabin, winding through a stand of aspen trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the mountain breeze. Sarah had forgotten how different hiking felt at this elevation. Each breath required conscious effort, and her legs, accustomed to gym treadmills and city sidewalks, protested the uneven terrain and steep inclines, but with each step, memories surfaced like bubbles in a mountain spring. Here was the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear that Elena had used as a landmark. There was the clearing, where they'd once surprised a family of deer grazing in the early morning mist. The trail followed the contours of the mountainside, with an intimacy that spoke of decades of careful use, each switchback positioned to maximize both safety and scenic value. Elena's map proved remarkably accurate. Every notation corresponded to reality. The fallen log that served as a natural bridge over a seasonal stream, the grove of towering pines that provided shelter from afternoon thunderstorms, the rocky outcropping that offered panoramic views of the valley below. Sarah began to understand that these maps weren't just navigational tools, but love letters to the landscape, detailed records of a deep and abiding relationship with this wild place. An hour into the hike, she encountered her first fellow human being since arriving at the mountain. An elderly woman was sitting on a flat boulder beside the trail, sketching wildflowers in a well-worn notebook. She looked up as Sarah approached, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "You must be Elena's granddaughter," the woman said, rising with the careful grace of someone accustomed to managing arthritic joints. "I'm Margaret Patterson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I live about 2 miles down the valley from your grandmother's place." Sarah accepted Maggie's firm handshake, surprised by the strength in those weathered fingers. "Sarah Martinez, I'm sorry, did you know my grandmother well?" "Well enough to miss her something fierce," Maggie replied. "Elena and I hiked these trails together for nearly 20 years. She was always finding new routes, new perspectives on familiar views. Made me see this old mountain with fresh eyes every season." They walked together for a while, Maggie pointing out changes in the landscape since Elena's passing. A landslide the previous winter had blocked one of Elena's favorite shortcuts. Wildfire damage from 2 summers ago was slowly healing with new growth. The mountain was constantly evolving, and Elena had documented those changes with the dedication of a scientist and the heart of a poet. "Your grandmother talked about you often," Maggie said, as they paused to rest beside a small waterfall. "She worried that city life was wearing you thin, that you'd forgotten how to listen to yourself. She hoped you'd find your way back here eventually." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her throat. "I wish I'd visited more before she died. I kept meaning to, but work was always so demanding, and Marcus didn't really understand why I'd want to spend time in the middle of nowhere." "Elena understood," Maggie said gently. "She knew you had to live your own life, make your own mistakes, but she also knew this place would be here when you needed it. Mountains are patient that way." They reached the summit of Morning Glory Trail just as the sun crested the eastern peaks, flooding the valley below with golden light. Sarah stood transfixed by the view, understanding suddenly why Elena had marked this spot with 3 stars on her map. The entire world spread out below them, forested slopes rolling into distant plains, a river threading silver through the valley floor, clouds casting moving shadows across a landscape that seemed to extend forever. "This is where your grandmother scattered your grandfather's ashes," Maggie said quietly. "She said he'd wanted to see the sunrise from up here every morning, for eternity." Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. She'd barely known her grandfather, who died when she was 3, but Elena had kept his memory alive through stories and traditions. Now, standing in this place where his ashes fed the mountain soil, Sarah felt connected to a lineage she'd nearly forgotten in her pursuit of corporate success and suburban respectability. The descent took them past a small meadow where Maggie pointed out the remains of an old homestead. "This was the Johansson place," she explained. "They farmed here in the 1920s before the Depression drove them back to town. Elena used to bring picnic lunches here when you were little. Said you loved exploring the old foundation stones." Sarah did remember suddenly and vividly. She'd been maybe 8 years old, creating elaborate fantasy kingdoms among the ruins, while Eleanor sat in the shade, reading a book. It had been a place of pure imagination, where anything seemed possible. As they approached the cabin in the late afternoon, Maggie extended an invitation that caught Sarah off guard. "We're having a community dinner at the fire station this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just potluck and conversation. Elena never missed one, and you'd be welcome if you're interested in meeting some of your neighbors." After Maggie continued down the trail toward her own home, Sarah sat on the cabin's front porch with Elena's trail map spread across her lap. The simple act of following her grandmother's carefully marked route had awakened something she hadn't realized was sleeping. For the first time since the divorce, she felt genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. 3 days later, Sarah learned why Eleanor had always been so meticulous about weather preparation. She woke to an ominous grey sky and wind that made the cabin's walls creak like an old ship. The morning air carried a metallic scent that reminded her of childhood storms. But the barometric pressure felt different at this elevation, more urgent somehow. By noon, the first fat raindrops were spattering against the windows, and Sarah realized she'd made a critical error in her preparations. She'd focused so intently on assessing structural damage that she'd failed to address the roof's immediate vulnerabilities. The missing shingles she'd noted on her repair list weren't just cosmetic problems. They were potential disasters waiting for the right storm. The rain began in earnest around 2 o'clock, driven by wind gusts that sent tree branches scratching against the cabin's exterior like desperate fingers. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as what had been a gentle mountain creek transformed into a rushing torrent, carrying debris from higher elevations. The sound of moving water grew from a whisper to a roar that seemed to come from the mountain itself. The first leak appeared above the fireplace, a steady drip that quickly became a stream. Sarah scrambled to position pots and buckets, but within an hour she was running out of containers as new leaks opened throughout the main room. Water began pooling on the pine floor, seeping between the boards and threatening the structural integrity of the entire cabin. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and Sarah realized she was facing more than just property damage. The combination of wind, rain, and elevation was creating conditions that could quickly become life-threatening. Her lightweight sleeping bag and camp stove suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate against the mountain's fury. As darkness fell, the storm reached a crescendo that made the cabin shake on its foundation. Sarah huddled in the loft, wrapped in every piece of clothing she'd brought, listening to the wind tear at the roof with increasing violence. Several times, she heard what sounded like large branches hitting the cabin's exterior, followed by scraping sounds that suggested damage she couldn't assess until daylight. Around midnight, hypothermia began to seem like a real possibility. Despite her layers of clothing, Sarah couldn't stop shivering, and her thoughts were becoming sluggish in a way that she recognized as dangerous. In desperation, she began searching through Elena's cedar chest for anything that might provide additional warmth. Hidden beneath the hiking maps and journals, Sarah discovered something that probably saved her life, a carefully sealed container holding emergency supplies that Eleanor had prepared for exactly this situation. Inside were waterproof matches, emergency candles, a compact emergency blanket designed for mountaineering, and most critically, instructions written in Elena's neat handwriting for surviving unexpected weather events. "The mountain demands respect," Elena's note began. "It will test your preparation and your resolve. Stay calm, stay warm, and remember that every storm passes eventually." The emergency supplies included a small alcohol stove and fuel tablets that burned cleanly indoors, providing both heat and the ability to warm food and water. Sarah followed Elena's instructions methodically, creating a survival space in the loft, using the emergency blanket to reflect her body heat and positioning the alcohol stove safely for maximum warmth. As she sat in her improvised shelter, sipping hot tea brewed on the emergency stove, Sarah felt a profound connection to her grandmother's wisdom. Elena had lived through decades of mountain storms, and her careful preparations reflected hard-won experience about survival in this unforgiving environment. The cache of supplies wasn't just practical, it was a form of protection extended across time. Elena's way of caring for granddaughter she wouldn't be alive to help. The storm raged through the night, but Sarah's emergency shelter kept her warm and alert. She used the long hours to read through Elena's storm survival notes, learning about wind patterns, seasonal weather variations, and the signs that preceded dangerous conditions. By dawn, she understood that this storm, while frightening, was relatively mild by mountain standards. When the wind finally died and watery sunshine began filtering through the clouds, Sarah climbed down from the loft to assess the damage. The main room looked like a disaster zone, with standing water throughout and several new holes in the roof. But she was alive, warm, and surprisingly calm about the challenges ahead. The storm had been her first real test of commitment to this mountain life, and Elena's preparation had helped her pass it. As she began the work of cleaning up and planning repairs, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood: complete confidence that she could handle whatever came next. The confidence lasted exactly until she climbed onto the cabin's roof the next morning. What had sounded like minor damage during the storm revealed itself as a near-catastrophic failure of the cabin's weather protection. 3 sections of roofing had blown away entirely, exposing the underlying structure to the elements. The chimney showed new cracks that ran from the roofline down to the stone base, and several support beams had shifted enough to create gaps that would welcome every future rainstorm. Sarah sat on the relatively stable portion of the roof, surveying damage that exceeded both her skills and her budget by an order of magnitude. The romantic notion of restoring the cabin with her own hands suddenly seemed not just naive, but potentially dangerous. Elena's emergency supplies had saved her through one storm, but the cabin wouldn't survive many more in its current condition. For the first time since arriving at the mountain, Sarah allowed herself to consider defeat. She could return to Denver, find an apartment, restart her career, and leave the cabin to decay naturally. It would be the practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that everyone from Carmen to her mother to her former colleagues would applaud. The thought filled her with a grief so immediate and overwhelming that she had to grip the roof edge to keep from sliding off. This place had become more than Elena's legacy or a refuge from her failed marriage. It had become home in a way that her suburban house with Marcus never had. The idea of abandoning it felt like abandoning herself. By afternoon, Sarah had made her decision. She would get professional help, even if it meant spending money she couldn't afford. Some things were worth the risk, and this cabin, this mountain, this chance at rebuilding her life qualified as essential. She walked to the general store to use their phone, finding the number for emergency roof repair in the local directory. 3 contractors either didn't answer or said they were booked solid through the fall. The 4th, a woman named Janet who ran a handyman service, listened to Sarah's description of the damage and whistled low. "Honey, that's not handyman work, that's full reconstruction. You need someone who specializes in mountain cabin restoration. Most of us regular folks won't touch those old places. Too many variables and too much liability. Is there anyone who would take it on?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Well, there's Jake Thorne. He's the only one around here who really understands those old cabins. His grandfather built half the structures in this valley back in the day. But Jake's picky about his projects, and he's expensive." Janet gave her Jake's number along with a warning. "Don't expect him to be available right away. He's usually booked months in advance, and he won't take on anything he doesn't think is worth saving." That evening, Sarah sat in the damaged cabin with Elena's address book spread before her on the kitchen table. The leather-bound book was filled with decades of accumulated contacts: doctors, neighbors, service providers, and friends. She found Jake Thorne's name about halfway through, written in Elena's careful script with a note beside it: "Reliable, honest, understands mountain building." The business card tucked behind the address book entry was weathered and simple, Thorne Construction, Jacob Thorne, mountain cabin specialist, restoration and repair. The phone number was handwritten in fading ink, and the card itself looked like it had been printed decades ago. Sarah stared at the card for a long time before picking up her phone. She'd been independent for months now, making every decision alone, relying only on herself. Asking for help felt like admitting failure, like acknowledging that she couldn't handle this mountain life she'd claimed to want. But as she looked around the cabin, with its bucket still positioned to catch drips and its gaping roof wounds, she realized that true independence meant knowing when to ask for assistance. Elena had clearly trusted Jake Thorne enough to keep his card for years. That endorsement would have to be enough. Sarah dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. The phone rang 4 times before a man's voice answered, rough with fatigue but not unkind. Thorne Construction. Mr. Thorne, my name is Sarah Martinez. I inherited my grandmother's cabin up on Miller Ridge, and I need help with storm damage. Elena Martinez was my grandmother, and she had your card in her address book. There was a pause, and when Jake spoke again, his voice had warmed noticeably. Elena's cabin. I haven't been up there since she passed. How bad is the damage? Jake Thorne arrived the next morning in a battered Ford pickup that looked like it had been climbing mountain roads for decades. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as he parked beside her Prius, the contrast between their vehicles highlighting just how unprepared she'd been for this environment. Where her car was sleek and efficient for city driving, his truck was scarred and practical, built for hauling materials over rough terrain. The man who emerged from the truck matched his vehicle perfectly. Jake appeared to be in his early 50s, with graying brown hair and the kind of weathered tan that came from years of outdoor work. He moved with the careful economy of someone whose body was both his primary tool and his most valuable asset. When he knocked on the cabin door, his greeting was polite but reserved. Ms. Martinez. I'm Jake Thorne. I was sorry to hear about Elena's passing. She was a good woman. Sarah invited him in, watching as his experienced eyes immediately began cataloging the storm damage. He moved through the cabin methodically, testing floorboards with his weight, examining the damaged ceiling with a small flashlight, running his hands along structural beams with the familiarity of someone who understood how buildings aged and failed. Tell me what happened during the storm, he said, not looking at her as he crouched to examine a section where water had pooled. Sarah described the night in detail, including her use of Elena's emergency supplies and the extent of the roof damage she'd observed. Jake listened without comment, occasionally asking specific questions about timing or water flow patterns. His attention felt clinical rather than personal, and Sarah found herself working to prove she wasn't just another city person playing at mountain life. When Jake climbed up to examine the loft and the roof access, Sarah followed despite his suggestion that she wait below. She wasn't going to be excluded from decisions about her own property, regardless of her inexperience. Jake seemed to understand this, offering his hand to help her navigate the ladder without making it feel condescending. On the roof, Jake's assessment was thorough and sobering. He pointed out problems Sarah hadn't even noticed: compromised flashing around the chimney, structural damage to the underlying rafters, and insulation that had been soaked beyond recovery. But he also identified the cabin's fundamental strengths, explaining how Elena's original construction had been built to last with proper maintenance. Your grandmother and my grandfather worked together on this place, Jake said, running his hand along a hand-hewn beam, back when people built things to survive whatever the mountain could throw at them. The bones are good, but they need attention. Sarah pulled out her yellow legal pad with its growing list of needed repairs. I know I'm in over my head, but I need to understand what we're looking at. Can you give me a realistic assessment of costs and timeline? Jake studied her for a moment, perhaps gauging her sincerity. Full restoration to make this place truly weatherproof. We're talking about $30,000 minimum, probably closer to 40. That's if we do most of the work ourselves, and I can source materials at cost. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her remaining savings wouldn't cover a quarter of that amount, and her credit was still recovering from the divorce. Jake must have seen her expression change because his tone softened. "But we don't have to do everything at once," he continued. "Elena always said you tackle mountain problems one stone at a time. We can prioritize the critical repairs, get you through next winter safely, and plan the rest in phases." Sarah appreciated his shift from assessment to planning, the way he'd moved from clinical evaluation to collaborative problem-solving. "What would you need from me? I don't have construction experience, but I'm willing to learn." Jake pulled out his own notebook, its pages filled with sketches and calculations from previous projects. "Elena mentioned you were smart and stubborn. That's actually perfect for this kind of work. I can teach you basic carpentry, but you'll need to be genuinely committed. Mountain construction doesn't forgive shortcuts or half measures." As they climbed down from the roof, Jake paused to examine the hammer hanging from his tool belt. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use, and the head showed the patina of countless projects. "This was my grandfather's hammer," he said, noticing her attention. "He built most of the original structures in this valley, including the foundation work on this cabin. Elena used to say that good tools carry the wisdom of the hands that use them." Sarah felt something shift in their dynamic, a recognition that this wasn't just a business transaction, but a continuation of something larger. "When could we start?" "I can begin emergency repairs tomorrow if you're serious about this. But understand, committing to restore this place means committing to a way of life that's harder than anything you experienced in the city. The mountain will test that commitment regularly." Looking around at the cabin that had already survived one major storm with her inside it, Sarah felt the same certainty that had carried her through that long, wind-torn night. "I'm ready to learn." Jake arrived at sunrise the next morning with a truck bed full of materials and the patience of someone who understood that teaching was as important as building. Sarah had spent the night reading Elena's emergency notes and preparing questions, determined to prove herself worthy of the investment Jake was making in her education. "First lesson," Jake said as they stood before the damaged roof. "Never work above your skill level without supervision, and never work alone on a roof. Mountains don't forgive overconfidence." He handed her a hammer that felt substantial in her hands, its weight balanced for control rather than power. This was Elena's hammer. She kept it in the shed for small repairs. "Seems fitting you should use it." The morning was spent learning the fundamentals that YouTube tutorials had skipped: how to read the grain of wood to predict how it would split, how to position your body for maximum control and minimum fatigue, how to listen to the sound of the hammer strike to know whether you'd hit true. Sarah's hands blistered within the first hour, but she refused Jake's suggestion to take a break. Elena was the same way, Jake observed as Sarah struggled to drive a nail straight, determined to master whatever she set her mind to. "She helped my grandfather rebuild Mrs. Patterson's barn after the blizzard of '88, first woman in the valley to learn timber framing." Sarah paused in her hammering, struck by this revelation about her grandmother. "I never knew Elena did construction work." "Mountain people do whatever needs doing," Jake replied, adjusting Sarah's grip on the hammer handle. Elena could frame a wall, deliver a calf, or navigate through a whiteout. Self-sufficiency wasn't a philosophy up here, it was survival. By mid-morning, they'd established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Jake would demonstrate a technique, then guide Sarah through her first attempts before stepping back to let her practice. His teaching style was methodical but encouraging, correcting mistakes without making her feel incompetent. When she finally drove 3 nails straight in a row, his quiet "good" felt like a significant victory. During their lunch break, Sarah discovered Elena's recipe box tucked behind the camp stove supplies. The wooden box was filled with index cards written in Elena's careful handwriting, documenting not just recipes, but notes about which dishes worked best for feeding work crews, which ingredients could be stored without refrigeration, and which meals provided sustained energy for physical labor. Elena's famous bean and cornbread, Jake said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. She fed that to every work crew that ever set foot on this mountain. Said it was the secret to keeping volunteers happy. Sarah studied the recipe, noting Eleanor's annotations about altitude adjustments and wood stove cooking times. "Would you mind if I tried making this for dinner? Seems like the least I can do since you're teaching me everything." Jake's smile was the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him. Elena would have liked that. She believed in feeding people properly, especially when they were working hard. The afternoon brought lessons in measuring and cutting, skills that required precision and planning rather than just physical strength. Sarah learned to use a level, understanding how mountain cabins settled over time and why Elena had built in subtle adjustments for future movement. Jake explained the relationship between structure and environment, how snow loads and wind patterns influenced every construction decision in mountain building. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Jake said as they worked together to position a replacement beam. "It's about understanding how the cabin needs to adapt to survive here." Elena designed this place to flex with the mountain's moods, not fight them. Sarah found herself thinking differently about the cabin's relationship to its environment. Instead of seeing the building as separate from the mountain, she began to understand it as part of the ecosystem, subject to the same forces that shaped the trees and stones around it. The perspective felt profound in a way that her corporate work had never been. Evening brought the satisfaction of a day's honest work and the challenge of cooking on Elena's temperamental wood stove. Sarah's first attempt at the bean and cornbread recipe was imperfect but edible, and Jake's appreciation seemed genuine rather than polite. They ate on the front porch, watching the light fade behind the peaks while discussing the next day's work. "You're learning faster than I expected," Jake said, accepting a second helping of cornbread. "Elena always said mountain work revealed character quickly. Can't fake competence when you're hanging off a roof." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the food or the lingering heat from the wood stove. For the first time since her divorce, she was building something instead of watching something fall apart. The physical soreness in her muscles felt like evidence of progress rather than merely endurance. As Jake prepared to leave, he paused at his truck. "Same time tomorrow? We'll start on the major structural repairs." "I'll be ready," Sarah replied, and meant it completely. She stood on the porch long after his taillights disappeared down the mountain road, listening to the evening sounds and feeling more at home than she had anywhere in years. The following week brought not just construction, progress, but Sarah's introduction to the broader mountain community. Through Jake's connections, their morning coffee routine had evolved into planning sessions where Jake would explain the day's work, while Sarah reviewed Elena's notes about local weather patterns and seasonal challenges. It was during one of these conversations that Jake mentioned the monthly community dinner at the fire station. "Elena never missed one," he said, reviewing their supply list for the day. "She usually brought her famous apple crisp and stayed late to help clean up. Community up here isn't just social, it's survival. We all depend on each other when things get difficult." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of social anxiety, the same feeling that had made Marcus's corporate dinner parties feel like endurance tests. But Jake's matter-of-fact description of Elena's participation suggested this would be different, more authentic than the carefully orchestrated networking events she'd grown to dread. Their trip to Patterson's Hardware that afternoon gave Sarah her first real glimpse into how the mountain community functioned. The store was a throwback to an earlier era, with narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with everything from horse tack to generator parts. The elderly man behind the counter, introduced as Bill Patterson, was Maggie's husband and apparently the unofficial keeper of local history. "So you're Eleanor's granddaughter," Bill said, emerging from behind the counter to shake her hand. "Elena was one of the finest people this mountain ever produced. Practical as a pocket knife and twice as sharp." "How's the cabin restoration coming along?" Sarah was surprised by how much Bill already knew about her project, until Jake explained that news traveled fast in a community where everyone's welfare affected everyone else's safety. Her storm damage and repair efforts weren't private business, but community concerns, discussed and monitored by neighbors who understood that an uninhabitable cabin was a liability for the entire area. "Jake, here's the best teacher you could ask for," Bill continued, pulling items from their supply list with the efficiency of someone who'd been matching tools to projects for decades. "His grandfather taught my father carpentry, and the knowledge just keeps passing down. Mountain building is an art form that can't be learned from books." The community bulletin board near the store's entrance caught Sarah's attention while Jake finalized their purchases. Among the usual notices about lost pets and equipment for sale was a photograph that made her stop entirely. It showed Elena at what appeared to be a community dinner, surrounded by familiar faces including a much younger Maggie Patterson and a man who could only be Jake's father based on the family resemblance. "That was taken about 15 years ago," Bill said, noticing her focus. Elena organized the community response after the flash flood damaged the Patterson Bridge. She convinced everyone to pool resources and labor to build something stronger than what was there before. Classic Elena, turning a disaster into an opportunity for improvement. Sarah studied the photograph more carefully, seeing her grandmother in a completely different context. Elena wasn't just participating in community life. She was clearly one of its leaders, someone others looked to for guidance and practical solutions. The realization that she was now occupying Elena's place in this network felt both inspiring and intimidating. Jake's suggestion that they stop by the feed store completed Sarah's introduction to the mountain's commercial ecosystem. The feed store doubled as an informal community center with a coffee pot that never emptied and conversations that ranged from livestock prices to weather predictions to local politics. Sarah listened to discussions about road maintenance, wildfire prevention, and the ongoing debate about allowing more development in the valley. "Tourism brings money," observed an older rancher whose weathered hands spoke of decades of outdoor work. "But it also brings people who don't understand how to live respectfully with the mountain. Some of these new folks think they can impose city expectations on wilderness reality." Sarah felt the subtle tension in this comment, recognizing that she could easily be categorized as one of those problematic newcomers. But Jake's presence and her obvious commitment to learning seemed to provide some protection from immediate judgment. The conversation continued around her without hostility, though she sensed she was being evaluated in ways both obvious and subtle. The drive back to the cabin gave Sarah time to process her introduction to mountain social dynamics. The community was clearly tight-knit and interdependent, with relationships built on practical mutual support rather than casual socializing. Elena's reputation had opened doors for Sarah, but maintaining those connections would require proving herself through actions rather than words. "The community dinner is Saturday," Jake said as they unloaded supplies at the cabin. "Maggie Patterson always organizes the new resident introductions. It's not optional if you want to be accepted here long-term." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar social anxiety, but she also recognized this as another test of her commitment to mountain life. "What should I bring?" "Elena's apple crisp recipe is probably in that recipe box," Jake suggested. "People remember traditions fondly, and it would be a way of honoring her memory while introducing yourself." That evening, Sarah found the apple crisp recipe, complete with Elena's notes about high-altitude baking adjustments and wood stove temperature management. As she read through the detailed instructions, she realized this wasn't just about making dessert. It was about carrying forward a tradition that connected her to Elena's legacy and to the community that had shaped her grandmother's life for decades. Saturdays. Community dinner marked a turning point in Sarah's mountain integration, but it was the week leading up to it that deepened her relationship with Jake in ways she hadn't anticipated. Working together daily had created an intimacy that went beyond their teacher-student dynamic. a comfort level that manifested in shared silences and an almost telepathic coordination when handling tools and materials. The major structural repairs required them to work in close physical proximity, Jake guiding her hands as she learned to operate the circular saw, steadying her as she navigated the steep roof angles, his quiet presence a constant source of confidence when her inexperience made tasks feel overwhelming. Sarah found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning, not just for the progress they'd make on the cabin, but for the easy companionship that had developed between them. Tuesday brought the discovery that would reshape their working relationship entirely. While clearing debris from the cabin's foundation, Sarah uncovered a folded paper tucked beneath a loose stone. The document turned out to be Elena's hand-drawn garden plans, detailed sketches showing seasonal plantings, companion species, and careful attention to sun patterns and water drainage around the cabin. Elena always said a cabin without a garden was just camping, Jake observed, as they studied the intricate drawings together. She spent decades perfecting this design, working with the mountain's natural rhythms instead of fighting them. The garden sketches revealed another dimension of Elena's mountain wisdom, her understanding that true self-sufficiency required food production as well as shelter. The plans showed raised beds positioned to catch morning sun and afternoon shade, herb spirals that maximize space while providing natural pest control, and fruit trees planted to create windbreaks that would protect both garden and cabin. Would it be possible to recreate this? Sarah asked, tracing the careful lines of Elena's design with her finger. I know nothing about mountain gardening, but these plans are so detailed. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped, adding another layer of complexity to an already ambitious restoration project. But when he looked up from the sketches, his expression showed something she hadn't seen before, genuine enthusiasm mixed with what might have been admiration. Elena started this garden the year after she built the cabin, he said. It fed her for 40 years and provided surplus for the entire community during difficult seasons. Recreating it would be like bringing back a piece of mountain history. The decision to restore Elena's garden transformed their daily routine from purely structural work to a broader vision of what the cabin could become. Jake's knowledge extended far beyond carpentry into soil management, plant selection, and the seasonal rhythms that governed successful mountain agriculture. Sarah discovered that his expertise had been shaped by the same generational wisdom that informed his building skills. My grandmother worked alongside Elena in this garden, Jake explained as they marked out bed locations according to Elena's specifications. Mountain women shared knowledge the way mountain men shared tools, understanding that everyone's success depended on community cooperation. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction in this work that differed from the cabin repairs. While carpentry challenged her physically and intellectually, gardening felt like meditation, a connection to cycles of growth and renewal that her corporate career had completely severed. The act of preparing soil, even in late spring, felt like an investment in a future she was still learning to envision. Their lunch breaks became planning sessions where they discussed not just immediate garden tasks, but long-term sustainability goals. Jake shared his knowledge of native plants that could provide both food and natural beauty, explaining how Elena had integrated wild species into her cultivated spaces to create a garden that looked natural while producing abundantly. Elena understood that the mountain would always be the dominant partner in any relationship, Jake said, as they shared sandwiches made from Sarah's improving attempts at Elena's bread recipe. She designed everything to work with natural systems rather than against them. The garden, the cabin, even her daily routines, all followed patterns that the mountain could support indefinitely. Sarah found herself studying Jake's face as he talked, noticing details she'd been too focused on work to observe before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful precision of his hands, even during casual conversation. the quiet confidence that came from decades of successful problem-solving in a demanding environment. She realized she was developing feelings that complicated their working relationship in ways she wasn't sure how to address. The attraction felt different from what she'd experienced with Marcus, less driven by shared ambitions and social compatibility than by respect for competence and character. Jake's knowledge and steady presence had become essential to her daily happiness, but she couldn't tell whether his growing warmth toward her reflected professional satisfaction or something more personal. Friday evening, as they finished installing the new chimney cap that would complete the cabin's weather protection, Jake surprised her with an unexpected invitation. "The community dinner tomorrow," he said, cleaning his tools with the methodical care she'd learned to associate with mountain practicality. "Would you like to ride down together? I could pick you up, save you from navigating the mountain roads in the dark." Sarah felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with social anxiety about meeting her new neighbors. "I'd like that very much." The community dinner went better than Sarah had dared hope. Elena's apple crisp was received with the kind of warm nostalgia that immediately established Sarah's place in the community's collective memory. Maggie Patterson made sure to introduce her to everyone, sharing stories about Elena that painted a picture of a woman who'd been both beloved and respected. Jake's presence at her side provided subtle social support without making her feel dependent, and by evening's end, Sarah felt genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The sense of belonging lasted exactly 4 days, until Marcus appeared at her cabin door on Thursday morning with a briefcase full of legal documents and an expression of barely controlled fury. Sarah was working in the garden when she heard the unfamiliar car engine laboring up the mountain road. Jake had gone to town for supplies, leaving her to transplant the native wildflower seedlings they'd started in makeshift greenhouse frames. The work was meditative, requiring careful attention to root systems and soil composition, and she'd been looking forward to showing Jake her progress when he returned. The sight of Marcus climbing out of his BMW sedan felt like a violation of everything she'd built in the mountains. He looked absurdly out of place in his tailored suit and Italian leather shoes, but his presence brought back all the feelings of inadequacy and anger she'd worked so hard to process. The mountains that had felt like sanctuary suddenly seemed fragile, unable to protect her from the past she'd been trying to escape. "Sarah, we need to talk," Marcus said without preamble, as if the months of separation and finalized divorce had been a minor inconvenience rather than the end of their marriage. "This mountain hermit phase has gone on long enough. There are serious legal and financial issues that require your immediate attention." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, wiping the soil from her hands with deliberate slowness before responding. "Our divorce is final, Marcus. We don't have any legal or financial connections that require discussion." "That's where you're wrong," Marcus replied, opening his briefcase with the theatrical flourish she remembered from his courtroom performances. "Your grandmother's property is part of a larger land dispute that affects the development rights for this entire area. There are parties interested in purchasing your cabin as part of a comprehensive resort development, and the offer is substantial enough to solve both our financial problems." The documents Marcus spread across Elena's kitchen table showed a proposed luxury mountain resort development that would encompass thousands of acres, including Sarah's property. The financial offer was indeed substantial, more money than she'd ever imagined owning, enough to restart her life anywhere she chose, with complete financial security. But as Sarah studied the architectural renderings of spa facilities and ski lifts, superimposed over the landscape she'd come to love, she felt a rage so pure it surprised her with its intensity. The mountains that had welcomed her grief and nurtured her healing would be transformed into a playground for people who would never understand their true value. "This is about your debts, isn't it?" Sarah said, finally understanding the real motivation behind Marcus's sudden legal concern. "Your gambling problems didn't end with our divorce. They just became more desperate without my salary to cover your losses. Marcus's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperation he'd been trying to hide behind legal authority. That's not relevant to the current situation. What's relevant is that you're sitting on an asset worth millions while living like a vagrant in a building that should be condemned. This is an opportunity to secure both our futures. Sarah gathered up the documents without reading them completely, her decision already made. My future is here, Marcus. Elena left me this land because she knew I'd need it, and she trusted me to protect it. I'm not selling to developers so you can fund whatever new scheme is consuming your life. You're making a mistake, Sarah, Marcus said, his tone shifting from persuasion to threat. There are legal mechanisms that can force property sales when development serves the broader public interest. Fighting this will cost you everything you have left. After Marcus left, taking his threats and his alien presence back down the mountain, Sarah found herself shaking with a combination of anger and fear. The peace she'd built felt suddenly precarious, dependent on legal protections she didn't understand and financial resources she didn't possess. The cabin that had felt like home now seemed like a target, marked for destruction by forces beyond her control. When Jake returned that afternoon, he found Sarah sitting on the front porch with a fireproof box she'd discovered in Elena's bedroom. Inside were her divorce papers, the final legal documents that had severed her connection to Marcus and everything their marriage had represented. "I need to burn these," Sarah said without explanation, holding up the papers that had once seemed so important. "I need to let go of who I was so I can become who I'm meant to be." Jake built a small fire in the stone circle Elena had used for outdoor cooking, understanding without questions that this ceremony was necessary for Sarah's complete transformation. As the papers caught flame and curled into ash, Sarah felt the last connections to her old life dissolving. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself, rather than as Marcus's former wife. Spring's arrival in the mountains brought changes that seemed almost magical after the harsh challenges of early restoration work. The garden that Sarah and Jake had planned so carefully began to emerge from the soil with a vitality that exceeded even Eleanor's detailed projections. Sarah woke each morning to new growth, new possibilities, and the increasingly certain knowledge that she had found not just a home, but a purpose that aligned with everything she valued most deeply. The seed collection Elena had preserved in airtight containers proved to be a treasure trove of varieties adapted specifically to mountain conditions. Sarah discovered heirloom tomatoes that thrived in the short growing season, beans that could handle sudden temperature drops, and herbs that provided both culinary and medicinal benefits. Each packet was labeled in Elena's careful handwriting with notes about planting times, companion plantings, and harvesting techniques refined over decades of experimentation. These seeds carry 40 years of Elena's garden wisdom, Jake explained as they planted the last of the cold-hardy crops. Every variety was selected for specific reasons, tested against mountain weather and soil conditions until only the most successful survived in her collection. Sarah found profound satisfaction in following Elena's instructions, feeling connected to her grandmother's patient process of learning what worked and what didn't in this challenging environment. The act of planting seeds that Elena had saved felt like continuing a conversation across time, honoring knowledge that had been accumulated through seasons of careful observation and thoughtful adaptation. The physical work of gardening complemented the construction projects beautifully, providing different types of challenges that used different skills and muscle groups. Where carpentry required precise measurement and careful planning, gardening demanded intuitive understanding of natural rhythms and patient acceptance of processes that couldn't be rushed. Sarah discovered she had aptitude for both, but gardening fed something in her soul that construction alone couldn't reach. Jake's knowledge extended seamlessly from building techniques to agricultural wisdom, another reflection of the mountain community's tradition of comprehensive self-sufficiency. He taught Sarah to read soil moisture levels by touch, to recognize the subtle signs of plant stress or disease, and to understand how weather patterns affected growth cycles in ways that differed significantly from lower elevation farming. Mountain gardening is about working with short seasons and variable conditions, he explained as they installed the drip irrigation system he'd designed to work with Eleanor's existing water sources. You can't control the weather, but you can create systems that help plants survive whatever nature provides. Their daily work rhythm had evolved into something that felt remarkably like partnership. Sarah's initial dependence on Jake's expertise had transformed into genuine collaboration, with her growing knowledge allowing her to contribute ideas and observations rather than simply following instructions. The garden project in particular showcased her developing instincts for mountain living, her ability to see patterns and connections that formal training couldn't have taught. The community's response to Elena's garden restoration generated enthusiasm that surprised Sarah with its intensity. Neighbors began stopping by to offer plants, seeds, and advice, sharing memories of Elena's gardening successes and failures. Maggie Patterson contributed starts from perennials that Elena had given her years earlier, creating botanical connections that spanned generations. Elena's garden fed half the valley during the drought of '02, Maggie explained as she helped Sarah transplant raspberry canes. She had techniques for water conservation that kept her plants healthy when everyone else's gardens were failing. This restoration isn't just personal. It's community historical preservation. The growing recognition of her project's broader significance gave Sarah confidence to tackle challenges that would have intimidated her months earlier. When late spring brought unseasonable frost that threatened the tender seedlings, she implemented Elena's cold protection strategies with a competence that earned Jake's quiet admiration. When Deer discovered the new plantings, she constructed fencing using techniques described in Elena's garden journals, adapting historical solutions to current needs. But it was during an evening in late May, as they sat on the completed front porch, surveying the emerging garden, that the relationship between Sarah and Jake shifted into territory neither had explicitly acknowledged. The cabin restoration was essentially complete. The garden was thriving, and the practical reasons for their daily collaboration were diminishing even as their personal connection deepened. "Elena would be proud of what you've accomplished," Jake said, accepting a glass of the herbal tea Sarah had brewed from their first herb harvest. "This place feels alive again in ways it hasn't since she passed." Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile in the evening light, noting the contentment in his expression as he surveyed their shared work. The attraction she'd been suppressing for weeks felt increasingly impossible to ignore, but she was uncertain how to bridge the gap between their working relationship and something more personal. The moment resolved itself with surprising naturalness when Jake turned to find her watching him, their eyes meeting with an understanding that required no words. The kiss that followed felt like the inevitable conclusion to weeks of growing intimacy, as natural and right as everything else they'd built together. "I've been hoping this would happen," Jake admitted quietly, his hand finding hers as they sat surrounded by the garden they'd created together. "But I didn't want to complicate the work you were doing, the healing you needed to accomplish on your own." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling more complete than she had since arriving at the mountain. "I think the healing and the building and the falling in love were all part of the same process. Elena's legacy wasn't just the cabin and garden. It was the possibility of a life lived fully and authentically, as stars appeared in the darkening sky above their thriving garden. Sarah understood that she had found not just peace, but love in this mountain. Sanctuary Elena had preserved for her. The idyllic peace of Sarah's mountain life shattered on a Tuesday morning in early June, when a convoy of black SUVs wound up the mountain road like a funeral procession. Sarah was working in the garden with Jake, harvesting the first lettuce crop and planning the summer plantings when the vehicles appeared. The sight of such obvious wealth and corporate authority in her sanctuary felt like a physical assault. The man who emerged from the lead vehicle wore a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire annual budget, but he moved with the confident ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of obstacles. His companions included what appeared to be lawyers, surveyors, and at least one person whose presence suggested security rather than legal support. Ms. Martinez, I'm Jonathan Blackwood, Senior Vice President of Development for Mountain Vista Resort Corporation, the man announced, approaching with a smile that managed to be both charming and predatory. I believe your ex-husband may have mentioned our interest in your property. Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, his protective instincts engaged by the obvious threat these visitors represented. Mr. Blackwood, you're trespassing on private property. Whatever business you think you have here was concluded when I refused your offer. Actually, that's not quite accurate, Blackwood replied, signaling to one of his companions who produced a leather portfolio. Our legal research has uncovered some fascinating historical details about your property that changed the nature of our discussion. Significantly, the documents, Blackwood, spread across Elena's garden table, were professionally prepared and deeply disturbing. Century-old land survey records showed that Elena's property sat at the center of a proposed resort development that would transform the entire valley. More concerning were recent geological surveys indicating that Sarah's land contained the primary water sources that would make the resort development viable. What you have here, Ms. Martinez, is not just a quaint mountain cabin, but the keystone property for a development that will bring hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in economic development to this area, Blackwood explained with the practiced enthusiasm of someone accustomed to selling dreams. The county commissioners are already on board, and we have preliminary approval for the entire project contingent only on acquiring your property. Sarah studied the survey documents with growing horror. The proposed resort would eliminate not just her cabin, but the entire ecosystem she'd come to love. Elena's trails would become ski runs, the pristine creek would be dammed for artificial snow production, and the quiet valley would be transformed into a playground for wealthy tourists who would never understand what they'd destroyed. And if I refused to sell? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Eminent domain proceedings are already in motion, Blackwood replied, his smile never wavering. The county can force the sale based on public benefit and economic development needs. However, voluntary sale would be significantly more profitable for you and much less unpleasant than protracted legal battles. Jake had remained silent during the exchange, but Sarah could sense his rising anger in the tension of his shoulders and the careful control of his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who understood mountain politics better than visiting developers. Those eminent domain proceedings assume county support that might not be as solid as you think, Jake said. This community has a long history of resisting outside development that doesn't serve local interests. Blackwood's smile flickered for the first time. Mr. Thorne, isn't it? Your construction business would certainly benefit from the resort development. We always hire local contractors for projects of this magnitude. Some things aren't for sale, Jake replied flatly. After the developers left, taking their threats and their alien presence back down the mountain, Sarah and Jake sat in stunned silence among the survey documents that now littered Elena's garden table. The peaceful future they'd been building together suddenly seemed fragile and temporary, threatened by forces that reduced their love and labor to obstacles blocking profit margins. How long do we have? Sarah asked, scanning through legal documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The eminent domain process takes months. Maybe a year if we fight it properly, Jake replied, his expression grim. But Blackwood wasn't bluffing about county support. There are people in local government who see dollar signs and job creation without understanding what would be lost. Sarah felt the weight of Elena's legacy pressing down on her shoulders. Her grandmother had preserved this land for 40 years, understanding its value in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. Now Sarah faced the possibility of becoming the generation that lost it all to corporate greed and political expediency. Elena wouldn't have given up, Sarah said finally, gathering the survey documents with new determination. She fought to protect this place for decades. I'm not going to be the one who surrenders it to resort developers. Looking across the garden they'd restored together, and the cabin they'd rebuilt with their own hands, Sarah felt a resolve crystallizing that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever this fight would cost, she was ready to pay it. The research into Elena's legal efforts began the next morning at the county courthouse, where Jake's connections with local officials proved invaluable in navigating bureaucratic obstacles. Sarah had expected to find minimal documentation of her grandmother's activities, but what they discovered in the dusty files exceeded her most optimistic hopes. Elena had been far more politically active than anyone had realized. Including Sarah herself, the correspondence files contained letters spanning 2 decades, documenting Elena's persistent efforts to establish conservation protections for the mountain valley. She'd worked with environmental organizations, contacted state legislators, and even engaged federal agencies in attempts to designate critical watersheds and wildlife corridors. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who'd understood the development pressures long before they became acute. Elena saw this coming 20 years ago. Jake observed as they spread the letters across a courthouse conference table. She knew that mountain property would eventually become too valuable for developers to ignore, and she was trying to create legal protections before the pressure became overwhelming. The most significant discovery was Elena's correspondence with the Colorado Land Conservancy, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving critical landscapes through conservation easements and protective land use designations. Elena had been working with them to establish protections that would prevent exactly the kind of development Blackwood was proposing. Sarah found herself reading her grandmother's words with a mixture of pride and regret. Elena's letters demonstrated sophisticated understanding of land use law, environmental protection strategies, and political processes that Sarah had never suspected. The correspondence revealed years of patient work building relationships with organizations and officials who shared Elena's commitment to preservation. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to a letter dated just 6 months before Elena's death. She was working on something called a conservation easement that would have protected the land permanently, but the process was incomplete when she passed away. The conservation easement documents were complex legal instruments that Sarah struggled to understand, but Jake's patient explanation helped clarify their significance. Elena had been negotiating to donate development rights to the Land Conservancy, permanently protecting the property from resort development while retaining ownership and the right to live there. The process had been nearly complete when Elena's unexpected death interrupted the final legal steps. Sarah felt a surge of excitement as she realized the implications. "Does this mean the conservation easement could still be completed? Can we finish what Elena started?" "Maybe," Jake replied cautiously. "But it depends on whether the Land Conservancy is still interested and whether the legal framework Elena established is still valid. Plus, these processes take time we might not have if Blackwood accelerates his eminent domain proceedings." Their afternoon at the courthouse yielded one more critical discovery. Documentation showing that Elena's property contained the primary aquifer feeding the entire valley's water supply. The geological surveys Blackwood had referenced were accurate, but they understated the environmental significance of the water sources. Without Elena's land, the ecosystem that supported the existing community would be fundamentally compromised. The drive back to the cabin gave Sarah time to process the magnitude of what Eleanor had been attempting. Her grandmother hadn't just been preserving a family retreat. She'd been protecting an entire ecosystem and the community that depended on it. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but it also clarified the stakes in ways that strengthened Sarah's resolve. That evening, Sarah called the Colorado Land Conservancy from the general store's phone, reaching a program director named David Chen, who remembered Elena's conservation efforts clearly. His enthusiasm for completing the interrupted easement process was encouraging, but his timeline estimates were sobering. Elena's preliminary work was excellent, but establishing a conservation easement typically requires 6 to 12 months of legal review and environmental assessment, Chen explained. If you're facing eminent domain proceedings, we'll need to expedite the process significantly, and that will require community support and political pressure to buy us time. Jake was waiting when Sarah returned from the phone call, and his expression suggested he'd been thinking along similar lines during her absence. "We need to organize the community," he said without preamble. "Elena's conservation work affects everyone in the valley, and Blackwood's development would destroy the water sources that support all our properties." Sarah felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders, a responsibility she'd never sought but couldn't avoid. "How do we start?" "We start by telling Elena's story," Jake replied. "The community needs to understand what she was trying to accomplish and why finishing her work matters for everyone's future." As they sat in the cabin Elena had built and preserved, surrounded by the garden they'd restored using her wisdom, Sarah understood that her journey had led to this moment of choice. She could continue hiding in Mountain Sanctuary, or she could stand up to defend what Elena had spent decades trying to protect. The community organizing began at dawn the next morning with a visit to Maggie Patterson, whose knowledge of valley politics and resident concerns made her the logical starting point for building opposition to the resort development. Sarah and Jake found her in her garden, transplanting tomato seedlings with the methodical care that characterized all mountain gardening efforts. "Elena's conservation work," Maggie said after listening to their explanation, her weathered hands never pausing in their task. "I knew she was corresponding with environmental groups, but I didn't realize how close she'd come to protecting the land permanently." That woman was always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Maggie's immediate support was encouraging, but her analysis of community dynamics was sobering. The valley residents were split between long-time families who valued the area's rural character and newer arrivals who'd moved to the mountains for recreational opportunities that might actually be enhanced by resort development. The Peterson family has been struggling to keep their ranch profitable, Maggie explained as they walked through her extensive vegetable garden. Blackwood's people have already approached them about selling grazing rights for golf course development. The money being offered is enough to save their operation and provide security for their retirement. Sarah felt the complexity of the situation settling around her like mountain fog. This wasn't a simple battle between conservation and development, but a community grappling with economic pressures that made Blackwood's offer genuinely attractive to some residents. Building effective opposition would require addressing those concerns rather than simply appealing to environmental sentiment. "We need to show people what they'd lose," Jake observed as they continued their circuit of potential allies. "Most folks don't realize that Elena's water sources feed the wells and springs that support every property in the valley. Lose that aquifer to resort development, and the existing community becomes unsustainable." Their next stop was Bill Patterson's hardware store, where the morning coffee crowd provided an informal but influential forum for community discussion. Sarah found herself nervous about addressing neighbors she was still getting to know, but Jake's introduction and Elena's reputation opened doors that her newcomer status might have kept closed. The response to Elena's conservation story exceeded Sarah's expectations. Residents who'd known Elena well expressed regret that her preservation efforts had been interrupted, while newer community members showed genuine concern about the environmental implications of large-scale resort development. More importantly, several people volunteered specific expertise that could support their resistance efforts. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a recently retired environmental scientist who'd moved to the valley for the clean air and quiet, offered to document the ecological significance of Elena's property in terms that regulatory agencies and courts would respect. Tom Morrison, a former county commissioner, provided insights into the political processes that Blackwood was manipulating and suggested strategies for building official opposition, eminent domain for private development is controversial even among pro-business politicians. Morrison explained over coffee that had grown cold during their intense discussion. If we can demonstrate significant community opposition and environmental concerns, we can probably delay the process long enough for your conservation easement to be completed. By afternoon, Sarah found herself coordinating a growing network of residents who'd volunteered to help with different aspects of their resistance campaign. The transformation from isolated newcomer to community organizer felt surreal, but the skills she'd developed in her marketing career translated surprisingly well to political organizing and coalition building. The most encouraging development was the enthusiastic response from younger families who'd moved to the valley, specifically to escape suburban development and corporate tourism. These residents brought energy, technological skills, and connections to environmental organizations that could provide support beyond the local community. Sarah's phone calls to state environmental groups yielded immediate interest in Elena's conservation work and promises of legal support for completing the easement process. The Nature Conservancy offered to expedite their review procedures, while the Sierra Club pledged volunteers for petition drives and public demonstrations if needed. By evening, the community response had crystallized into a formal organization, with Sarah reluctantly accepting the role of coordinator. The Elena Martinez Conservation Coalition would work simultaneously to complete Elena's conservation easement and build political opposition to Blackwood's development proposal. The day's final task was the most personally significant for Sarah, creating a petition that would demonstrate community support for protecting Elena's land. As she worked at Elena's kitchen table, drafting language that honored her grandmother's vision while appealing to contemporary environmental concerns, Sarah felt the weight of stewardship that Elena had carried for decades, whereas Elena Martinez dedicated her life to preserving the natural and cultural heritage of Miller Valley, Sarah wrote, and whereas her conservation efforts represent the shared values of our mountain community, we, the undersigned residents, pledge our support for completing her vision of permanent protection for the lands and waters that sustain our way of life. Jake read over her shoulder as she refined the petition language. His presence a steady reminder that this fight wasn't something she had to face alone. Elena would be proud of what you're building here, he said quietly. You're not just defending her legacy, you're becoming the community leader she always believed you could be. The next morning would bring the hard work of door-to-door organizing, but tonight Sarah felt the satisfaction of having found her purpose. The broken woman who'd arrived at the mountain seeking only healing had discovered strength she'd never known she possessed. The week before the decisive town hall meeting brought an intensity of preparation that reminded Sarah of her most demanding corporate campaigns, but with stakes that felt infinitely more personal. The community response to their organizing efforts had exceeded all expectations, with petition signatures arriving daily and offers of support coming from environmental groups across the state. Yet Sarah found herself battling familiar demons of self-doubt and imposter syndrome as the moment of truth approached. The night before the meeting, Sarah discovered Elena's final letter while searching through the cedar chest for documents that might support their conservation arguments. The envelope was sealed with wax and labeled in Elena's distinctive handwriting, "For Sarah, when you find your strength." Inside, Elena's words carried the wisdom and encouragement that Sarah desperately needed to hear. "My dearest granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have found your way to the mountain and discovered the person you were always meant to become. The struggles that brought you here were necessary preparation for the challenges you now face, and I trust completely in your ability to protect what we both love." Elena's letter went on to describe her own journey from a young widow, overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising children, alone, to a confident woman who'd learned to trust her instincts and fight for what mattered. The parallels to Sarah's transformation were so precise they seemed almost prophetic, as if Elena had understood exactly what trials would shape her granddaughter's character. "The mountain teaches us that growth requires both roots and resilience," Elena wrote. "You have developed both through the work of restoration, the challenge of learning new skills, and the gift of love that I see growing between you and Jake. Trust these foundations when you speak tomorrow, and remember that you carry not just my hopes, but the wisdom of every generation, of women who've learned to protect what they love." The letter's final paragraph provided specific guidance that proved Elena's political sophistication had been even greater than the courthouse documents had suggested. Elena had researched precedents for conservation easements, identified sympathetic officials in state government, and even developed arguments about economic benefits that would appeal to development-minded politicians. "The resort will bring temporary jobs and short-term profits," Elena had written. "But conservation protects permanent value that supports the community indefinitely. Water sources, wildlife habitat, and scenic beauty are assets that appreciate over time, while resort development creates dependency on tourist cycles that can disappear when economic conditions change." Sarah read the letter 3 times before sharing it with Jake, who'd arrived for their final strategy session with coffee and the kind of steady presence that had become essential to her peace of mind. His reaction to Elena's words mirrored her own mixture of gratitude and awe at her grandmother's prescient understanding. "She knew this day would come," Jake said quietly, "and she knew you'd be the one to face it. Elena spent decades preparing for this battle, and now her preparation becomes your strength." The evening brought an unexpected and deeply meaningful conversation about their future together. Jake's proposal wasn't the romantic gesture Sarah might have once expected, but rather a practical discussion of partnership that felt perfectly suited to their mountain life and shared values. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that building this life with you has been the most meaningful work I've ever done," Jake said as they sat on the porch overlooking their thriving garden. "Whether we're fighting developers or just living quietly together, I want to do it as partners in every sense." Sarah felt tears she hadn't expected, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of Jake's words. "I love you too," she replied, "and I love the life we've built here. Tomorrow, we're not just defending Elena's legacy, we're protecting our future together." The proposal of marriage that followed felt like the natural conclusion to months of building trust, competence, and shared commitment to values that went deeper than romantic attraction. They would face the town hall meeting as engaged partners, united in their determination to protect the mountain community that had given them both purpose and belonging. As dawn approached, Sarah felt a calm certainty that surprised her with its completeness. The anxious, broken woman who'd first climbed this mountain had been transformed through work, love, and the discovery of causes worth fighting for. Elena's letter had reminded her that this transformation had been the point all along, that healing herself and protecting the land were part of the same essential process. The town hall meeting would determine whether their community organizing had been effective, whether Elena's conservation vision could still be realized, and whether the mountain sanctuary that had saved Sarah's life could be preserved for future generations. But regardless of the outcome, Sarah knew she'd found the strength Elena had always believed she possessed. Standing in the garden as the first light touched the mountain peaks, surrounded by the evidence of their successful restoration work and supported by the love that had grown alongside their shared labor, Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges the day would bring. The mountain had taught her patience, Jake had taught her competence, and Elena's legacy had taught her courage. The woman who would speak at the town hall meeting bore little resemblance to the one who'd arrived at the cabin months earlier. And that transformation was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The Miller Valley Community Center had never hosted a meeting as contentious or well-attended as the one that convened on that warm June evening. Cars and trucks filled the parking lot and lined the rural road for half a mile in both directions, bringing together residents, environmental activists, county officials, and corporate representatives in a confrontation that would determine the valley's future for generations to come. Sarah arrived early with Jake, carrying Elena's correspondence files and the community petition that now bore over 300 signatures. The foundation stone from Elena's original cabin construction served as her talisman, a piece of mountain granite that Elena had carved with the date 1973 and the words "built to last." Sarah kept it in her pocket as a reminder of the enduring strength that had sustained Elena through decades of challenges. The meeting room buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in, many carrying signs supporting conservation, while others displayed pro-development materials emphasizing job creation and economic growth. Sarah recognized the fundamental division that their campaign would have to bridge, the tension between preservation and prosperity that had shaped rural communities throughout the American West. Jonathan Blackwood arrived, with a larger entourage than before, including professional presenters equipped with charts, graphs, and architectural models designed to make the resort development seem inevitable and beneficial. The corporate display dominated one side of the room, a stark contrast to the handmade signs and grassroots organization that characterized the conservation supporters. County Commissioner Patricia Walsh called the meeting to order with the weary authority of someone accustomed to mediating conflicts between development pressures and community concerns. Her opening remarks emphasized the need for civil discourse and fact-based discussion. But the underlying tension in the room suggested that emotions would play a significant role, regardless of official procedures. Blackwood's presentation was polished and persuasive, emphasizing economic benefits that would flow from resort development while minimizing environmental concerns with studies funded by his own corporation. He projected images of luxury accommodations nestled tastefully among the trees, ski slopes that followed natural terrain, and spa facilities that supposedly enhanced rather than compromised the mountain environment. Mountain Vista Resort represents a 21st century approach to sustainable tourism that will provide hundreds of permanent jobs while preserving the natural beauty that makes this area special, Blackwood concluded, his confident smile suggesting certainty about the evening's outcome. This development will put Miller Valley on the map as a world-class destination while respecting the environmental values that residents treasure. The applause that followed Blackwood's presentation was polite but noticeably restrained, suggesting that his corporate message hadn't resonated as strongly as he'd expected. Sarah felt encouraged by the lukewarm response, but she knew her own presentation would face equally skeptical evaluation from residents concerned about economic opportunities. When Commissioner Walsh called Sarah forward to present the conservation perspective, she felt the weight of every eye in the room and the pressure of representing not just Elena's legacy, but the hopes of everyone who'd supported their organizing efforts. The foundation stone in her pocket provided tactile reassurance as she stepped to the podium. "My name is Sarah Martinez, "And I'm Elena Martinez's granddaughter," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "3 months ago, I came to this mountain broken by divorce and failure, seeking only a place to hide from the world. What I found instead was a community that taught me the difference between surviving and thriving, between taking from the land and working with it." Sarah's speech drew on Elena's letter for both content and inspiration, weaving together personal transformation and environmental protection in terms that honored both economic concerns and conservation values. She spoke about water sources that sustained the entire community, about wildlife corridors that supported hunting and tourism, and about the kind of authentic mountain culture that attracted visitors, precisely because it hadn't been commercialized. Elena Martinez spent 40 years proving that conservation and prosperity can coexist, Sarah continued, feeling confidence build with each sentence. Her garden fed neighbors during droughts, her trails provided recreation without destroying habitat, and her example showed that individual stewardship can create community wealth that lasts for generations. The most powerful moment came when Sarah revealed Eleanor's completed conservation easement application, which the Colorado Land Conservancy had agreed to expedite if the community demonstrated unified support. The legal framework Elena had developed would permanently protect the critical water sources while allowing existing residents to continue living and working in the valley. "We're not asking you to choose between jobs and environment," Sarah concluded, looking directly at residents she knew were struggling with economic pressures. "We're asking you to choose between temporary profits that will disappear when the next recession hits tourism, and permanent protection for the resources that have sustained this community for over a century." The standing ovation that followed Sarah's presentation exceeded anything she'd dared hope for. But more importantly, she could see minds changing in real time as residents who'd been undecided recognized the superiority of Elena's preservation approach over Blackwood's development promises. The formal vote that followed was closer than conservation supporters had hoped, but decisive enough to block Blackwood's eminent domain proceedings. More significantly, the county commissioners agreed to support Elena's conservation easement as an alternative that addressed both economic and environmental concerns. As residents filed out of the community center, many stopping to congratulate Sarah and sign up for ongoing conservation work, she felt the profound satisfaction of having honored Elena's trust while discovering her own capacity for leadership and community service. 6 months later, the transformation of Sarah's life had become as complete as the restoration of Elena's cabin. The November morning was crisp with the promise of winter, but the cabin glowed with warmth from the wood stove that Jake had rebuilt to Elena's original specifications. Sarah stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast on the same cast-iron stove where Elena had cooked for decades, feeling the profound continuity that connected past and future in this mountain sanctuary. The conservation easement had been finalized in September, permanently protecting Elena's land and the critical water sources that sustained the entire valley. The Colorado Land Conservancy had celebrated the agreement as a model for community-driven conservation, and Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences about grassroots environmental organizing. The broken marketing executive who'd fled to the mountains had discovered a new career as a conservation advocate, work that felt more meaningful than anything she'd accomplished in corporate America. But the most visible symbol of her transformation was the new business sign that Jake had installed. Beside the cabin's front gate, Thorne Martinez Construction, Mountain Restoration Specialists, announced their partnership to the world, reflecting both their personal commitment and their shared expertise in preserving historic mountain structures. The construction business had grown beyond their most optimistic projections, with requests for restoration work coming from throughout the region. Elena's garden had exceeded even her careful projections. producing abundance that fed Sarah and Jake throughout the growing season, while providing surplus for the community food bank that Maggie Patterson coordinated. The seed varieties Elena had preserved continued to prove their value, adapted perfectly to mountain conditions and productive enough to support the kind of self-sufficiency that had always been Elena's goal. The morning's first task was reviewing plans for their January wedding, a small ceremony that would take place in the cabin where Elena had hosted community gatherings for 40 years. Sarah had initially envisioned something more elaborate, but the mountain had taught her to value authenticity over spectacle. The guest list included the neighbors who'd become family, the environmental allies who'd supported their conservation work, and even Carmen, who'd finally admitted that mountain life seemed to suit her sister perfectly. Jake emerged from the workshop where he'd been crafting wedding rings from gold, recovered from an abandoned mine claim Elena had inherited decades earlier. The rings represented another connection to Elena's legacy, jewelry that carried the literal substance of the mountain they'd committed to protecting. His proposal had been characteristically practical, but the rings showed a romantic sensibility that made Sarah appreciate the depth of his feelings. "The Peterson family wants us to assess their old homestead cabin for restoration," Jake said, accepting the coffee Sarah had brewed from beans roasted at the general store. "They're interested in converting it to a guest house for eco-tourism that would complement the conservation work rather than compete with it." Sarah nodded approvingly, recognizing how their restoration expertise was creating economic opportunities that aligned with conservation values rather than conflicting with them. The Peterson project would be their largest contract yet, but more importantly, it represented the kind of sustainable development that Elena had always advocated. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Marcus, who arrived in the same BMW that had seemed so alien to the mountain environment months earlier. But where his previous visit had felt like an invasion, this encounter carried the awkwardness of a painful past that had lost its power to wound. Sarah received him on the front porch with polite curiosity, noting how diminished he seemed in the setting she'd made her own. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus said without his usual corporate confidence, "and to tell you that you were right about this place. I can see why you chose to stay." Marcus's apology was perfunctory and self-serving, but Sarah found herself able to accept it without anger or bitterness. The woman who'd been destroyed by his betrayal had been replaced by someone whose happiness depended on values he'd never understood. His presence reminded her how far she'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. After Marcus left, taking his awkward presence back to whatever new complications defined his life, Sarah and Jake sat in the swing Jake had built on the front porch, watching the light fade behind the peaks that had become as familiar as old friends. The silence between them was comfortable and complete, the satisfaction of shared work and mutual commitment. "Elena would be proud of what we've built here," Jake said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders as they surveyed the garden now dormant for winter, but rich with the promise of spring renewal. The cabin, the business, the conservation work, all of it growing from the foundation she laid decades ago. Sarah leaned into Jake's warmth, feeling the profound peace that came from alignment between values and actions, between dreams and reality. The mountain that had welcomed her grief and nurtured her healing had become home in the deepest sense, a place where her work contributed to something larger than personal success or individual happiness. As stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Sarah understood that Elena's greatest gift hadn't been the cabin or the land, but the example of a life lived with purpose and integrity. The broken woman who'd climbed this mountain seeking only survival had discovered not just healing, but the capacity to heal others through preservation work that would protect this sanctuary for generations to come.